right beside the row of pictures is a set of 9 dots.
Okay.
If you click on that, you can see everybody.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is coming from someone who knows nothing about technology.
Well, I appreciate that, Judy. You know more than I do about Zoom, that's for sure. So thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, that helps. Great. Well, so we're recording. This is the April 30th meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. Welcome, everyone. We've got an agenda posted on our website, a draft proposed agenda. So want to just make sure the subcommittee members are good with that, or whether there's any changes. So any discussion of the draft agenda. Okay. And I will note for members of the public who are joining us today, we have taken the advice of our facilitators and some of our subcommittee members and have added a second opportunity for public comment today. So there'll be one roughly in the middle of our meeting, tentatively scheduled at 10:55, and then there'll be another one near the end of the meeting around 11:55. So you have opportunities to weigh in throughout if you're interested. And when we get nearer to those times, we'll see who is interested in commenting and proceed accordingly. Other task is to approve our minutes from our April 23rd meeting. Any discussion, revisions to those minutes? Okay, consider those approved. Thanks, everyone. So just a couple more framing comments. I think today's agenda, we've got some of our kind of now more standing agenda items, some report outs from some of our groups, both bigger and smaller than ours, some discussion of some specific topics, and then per David's suggestion, some unstructured time near the end of the meeting to kind of just share ideas and brainstorm about how best to use our time and conduct our work going forward. And certainly, I know Abby and I welcome any of your all suggestions on how to use these meetings more effectively. So, that's a great suggestion that David had, and, don't hold back with other ideas. Abby, anything you want to add?
No.
Okay.
Sorry. I've literally been in meetings since 8, so my brain's scrambling. I'll get here eventually.
Doesn't sound like farming.
There's no farming.
All right. Well, with that, Jane, would you mind doing the first agenda item for us, which is an update from both the full council meeting and the recent steering committee meeting?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you, Billy. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Happy Friday. So briefly, in case you missed it, I feel like for people like Lauren, they get to hear me do the same thing over and over again, so she can quiz me on how if I say the same thing at every subcommittee meeting. But for those of you who weren't able to join us on Monday for the full council meeting, it was a substantive agenda with 3 main areas of focus. First and foremost, we talked about the Climate Action Plan draft outline, which you all helped review last week. And I think there's some further work for us to do around the sequestration and resiliency components of the plan, as well as the science and data thoughts in the plan. So we ran that through with the full council, as well as considered the option of considering the December 1st as the date that we would present a full, complete, but draft plan. And that is really being driven by both the recognition of when we're going to know what with the technical analysis, as well as sort of sufficient time needed to do the public engagement components that we're hearing loud and clearly we need to do to have a thoughtful plan, especially as it pertains to the justice, equity, and inclusion components of the law. There was no consensus reached on the December 1st date at the council meeting. And when we get to the steering committee meeting in 1 minute, I'll update you on where we're landing with that. The other two main components of the agenda with the Climate Council wholly was around introducing our climate access and RISE consultants who will be working with us on the public engagement and outreach components of the work over the next 9 months or so. And in introducing them, the Just Transitions co-chairs spoke to their work to date on thinking about public engagement and drafting principles that will be available to all of you, other subcommittees shortly, as well as powerfully shared the Renew advocacy letter that I have now shared. I shared with all of you last week and encourage you all to read, which was a critique of how well the law and then subsequently setting up the subcommittees and council itself did at including diverse voices in the process. And so we're thinking about and reflecting on how to better work to meet the goals put forward in the law, as well as the letter, and just be better in general. So that was really great. I thought it was a really helpful conversation. The next steps with Climate Access and RISE is for us to sort of kick off internal coordination with them through the agency, but also then to immediately sort of walk them around to the other subcommittees, as well as coordinate with the Public Service Department around the Comprehensive Energy Plan outreach and engagement. And just for all of your understanding and knowledge as you're planning and thinking about work planning and substantive work, there's like these three main components we're thinking about with those consultants and our engagement, which is first and foremost, like as soon as possible, to do some outreach and engagement with Vermonters around helping us frame the issues that we need to be thinking about, and so that we're not going out to the public for them to react to something, but actually going out and listening and trying to take in information to help inform the strategies and recommendations that you'll be thinking about in the subcommittee and beyond. So that will be coming soon, and depending on where we do and don't land with December 1st as a draft first final plan, that will then inform all the milestones that we have in front of us for the work around public engagement and strategies and recommendations development. So finally, the last main component of the Climate Council meeting was really around the role of the Climate Council in the coming months, recognizing that the meat of the work is really happening at the subcommittee level now, and thinking specifically about the need to, in real time, keep co-chairs of subcommittees touching base to sort of consider where there's overlap, consider where there's possible conflict or missed gaps with respect to the work that we should be addressing. And that wasn't actually decided at the Climate Council meeting either on how to appropriately do that. So those were the three main topics at the Climate Council, and maybe I'll just sort of pivot right into the steering committee meeting yesterday, because I think there was a little bit more clarity provided around some of those issues yesterday at the steering committee. And then I'll pause for questions after that. So as I suggested, there was a lot sort of left up in the air at the Climate Council. We brought forward many of those issues to the steering committee yesterday. Some were decided upon and some weren't. First and foremost, the December 1st draft plan. Very astutely, the steering committee suggested that while that authority lays with the Climate Council to approve the plan on December 1st, and the statute is somewhat ambiguous about what that is. It really speaks largely to a plan, a climate action plan, but the nuance of draft in front of it and what we've done for public engagement is somewhat, it could be interpreted. But the idea being that we've had internal counsel, Matt Chapman, as well as Megan O'Toole, speak with Julie and I around that language, but we weren't able to clearly speak for them at the steering committee meeting yesterday. So Secretary Young has asked for clear guidance and recommendation from General Counsel and ANR around the statute and whether or not we can have a December 1st draft plan rather than a final plan. In addition, it feels like while the legislature has sort of ceded their responsibility to the Climate Council and they do not have a role in approving the plan, it would behoove us to sort of test the waters around if the legislature will support the idea of a draft plan on December 1st rather than a final plan. So I got tasked with helping support some talking points for legislatively appointed council members to do outreach with the legislature. So that'll be forthcoming in sort of testing how the legislature feels about a December 1st draft date. And of course, in all of this, I'll just suggest that the idea being that regardless of if the plan says draft or final, you know, the Agency of Natural Resources must complete rulemaking by the end of 2022. So we need to think about the implications of sort of bumping back a final plan till March, and how would we be able to hit the ground running, perhaps even without a final plan, to think about rulemaking, as well as thinking about what we could do in the legislative session next year if we weren't completely done till March. Because we're not thinking about changing any of the statutory requirements deep down in the law around the emissions requirements. We're only thinking about how we can do better around the planning process with public engagement, as well as the understanding of when we'll know what with the technical consultants. So stay tuned. And I do feel like it's really impactful for the subcommittees, especially, to know what the date is, because if you right now, the way the milestones read is you'd be testing strategies and with the public in June, which is coming right up since tomorrow's May. And I think this would give us a little bit more breathing room. So I'll pause there, and then I'll shift to the convening of the co-chairs and the public engagement components and training. So any questions around the December 1st date or what we did and didn't decide on?
Thanks, Jane. I would just, oh, go ahead, Alyssa, I'm sorry.
That last piece, Jane, where you were talking about this extension or change in the reporting on December 1st might give us a little bit more room. How much more room are you talking about?
Well,
what does
so
that mean?
In practice, we would want to do that testing of strategies as soon as possible. But at the same time, we also recognize that there's this component of hearing from the public without going out with strategies and recommendations, which hasn't started yet. And so I wish I could tell you the exact timeline, but we're meeting on Monday with the consultants to talk about what they see as a realistic timeline to get you the input from the public to help inform the strategies that then you would go out with that next phase of engagement of sort of testing and running with. And so my expectation is it wouldn't be like September. We'd be looking at like July instead of June for that testing. You know, the hope would be we'd still be somewhat on track with the milestones, but just slightly pushed back to provide the space up front to hear from the public now.
It's great to hear that. That's kind of what I read in from what you said, but I wanted to just clarify. Thank you.
Thanks, Alyssa. Billy, did you have something?
That was really going to be my question, was just to kind of drill down to what the implications were specifically. So that was helpful.
Thanks. So the next component at the steering committee was to revisit the renew letter that was sent to the Climate Council, as well as administration officials and others, and also think about some suggested approaches and what that letter really speaks to. And so it has felt like our focus on engagement and outreach has been a lot of thought about how we step out of the council and subcommittees and involve Vermonters even more broadly. But I think what we're recognizing is the need to also do sort of in-reach and training both amongst subcommittee members and the full council for diversity, equity, inclusion, and how we hear from diverse voices and incorporate them, even from the folks who are at the table already, let alone how we go out and bring even more voices in. And so Sarika had recommended some trainings. She is the principal for WISE Consulting. And we thought about that, and it was put on me to consider training opportunities in this space, and request and consider that the next council meeting in May would have a focus on providing space for training for all council members and subcommittee members to be invited in. And if that time doesn't work or can't work for all subcommittee members, then we'll think about how to provide that training, if not only at the council meeting, but another opportunity for everybody to get involved and be thinking about that space. And then I'll just say that in tandem to that, one of the ideas has been per diems and the equity of per diems that we pay for folks to participate in both the council and at the subcommittee level. There's been no change in the statutory language for per diems for decades, and so $50. The question of is $50 enough really to get people who, time, money, it all matters to get the right people around the table who aren't doing this for professional work. And that's sort of moved at lightning speed, and I won't go into the details of it, but the idea now is that there will be an amendment to the budget, this budget on the floor in the Senate, in committee still for the Senate this week, to raise per diems for council members and subcommittee members to $100, notwithstanding, all the other councils and boards that are out there. There are exceptions currently for some councils and some boards. The parole board is the one I hear about the most that is $100 per diem. So we have the money from our budget adjustment to pay because for folks to get $100, so it wouldn't impact our budget. And so our hope is that it'll make it through this session, and that starting July 1st with the new budget, we'll be able to pay subcommittee members and council members $100 for their work and service on subcommittees and councils. And then, of course, I think you all know that we have money in the contract with Climate Access and RISE to pay for participation in the public engagement space. So we're thinking a lot about how to bring people to the table and not have cost and time be a barrier. So that's it on that one. Any comments on that? And then I think there was one more thing, but I can't remember now.
Just a thank you. That's nice to have that being rounded up. Because $6.25 an hour is less than federal minimum wage. So
yeah, I hear you. I feel like there was one more thing, Lauren, on the steering committee, but I've rambled so much now I can't remember.
Oh,
what it was.
When the
the
chairs
co-chair
are going to meet. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Billy. So there was the final space and conversation was around the idea that the steering committee in service of the council would be that what we put forward to the council was that the steering committee would convene the co-chairs. And one of the steering committee meetings would be around formulating agendas for the full council meeting, and the other meeting would be the space for co-chairs to come together to provide updates and sort out any issues that are rising to the surface. And that is how we laid it out in the process roadmap that was formally adopted by the council. But there was some idea or perhaps notion that the council should meet more regularly and for shorter intervals and pull everybody together on a bi-weekly basis. In the end, I will say when I informally queried co-chairs about this, as well as did some homework, the feeling was overwhelming that the steering committee was an appropriate place to do that convening, recognizing that council members are more than welcome to participate in all steering committee meetings, and that we would go above and beyond to ensure that council members felt like they had equal voice at the table to speak up during those meetings, so that they could participate on those days as well. And that we'll be thinking about shifting the steering committee, which currently meets on Thursday, to meet every other Monday off the bi-weekly off weeks of the council, to sort of have a lined up time with the other council meetings, so that people can generally, who participate in the council meetings, have that time and could participate on Mondays too. And hoping that that time works better than the Thursday time did for co-chairs. So stay tuned for that, but they'll be posted publicly. Yeah, and I'll send around an email updating all subcommittee members and counselors around how those get scheduled so you can participate as you want.
Great, thanks,
Thanks.
Jane. Lauren, did you have your hand up? Oh, no.
No, I didn't. I just want to flag that there was a lot of chat conversation at steering committee about this very topic. And I think Chris Campany raised that if there is a quorum of council members, even if it's not a meeting of the council, there could be a concern there. So I'll leave that as a flag for, thankfully not me to have to figure out. Sorry, Jane.
Thanks, Lauren.
Well, thanks, Jane. That was a lot of updates. I think, this group's very interested in the conversation around timeline and opportunities to engage the public. So, please keep us posted on how that moves forward, but encouraging to hear that people are taking those issues very seriously and trying to create a little bit more space for us to do our work. So thanks for that. Okay, any other questions for Jane or questions about general process structure? Okay. So we're right on time. Going to move on to a segment where we provide brief updates from the different task coordination efforts, and then hopefully Iris can also provide us a weekly update from the Just Transitions group as our liaison. So Abby, would you mind if we start with you?
Nope, that's fine. We had I'll call it an efficient meeting this week. We have set out some shared document space of starting to try to bucket out the different ways in which the different programs, laws, it's different land usages, things like that, where we feel like we need to plug in to think about what a sustainable economy and a just and resilient food system looks like moving forward. We are going to be working in the next week to come up with starting to build out our ideas around stakeholder engagement and who we need to be bringing in to sort of populate, to Jane's point, before we get a whole bunch of things on the table as to what we think is necessary. How do we make sure that our thinking is aligned with what communities on the ground are thinking is needed or is going to benefit them or help them ensure that the food system is built out in a way that is just and resilient and culturally relevant to all Vermonters. And yeah, so we're just sort of plugging away at putting things into buckets and starting to build out, where we start to look.
Great. Any questions for Abby? Okay. Lauren, how about your group?
Yeah, the nature-based group started talking similar to Abby's group, doing an inventory of existing statute programs, opportunities from elsewhere in the world. And we also spent a non-trivial amount of time creating a list of potential stakeholders, groups, impacted communities, et cetera, so that we can have that list should any of us be reaching out to them individually within our day-to-day lives and getting ideas from them, as well as just having that list theoretically ready should we get support from our public engagement process, and make sure that we at least are starting to build out that work so that we can jump on engaging as many people as possible. I think those were the two major parts of our conversation this week.
And Lauren and colleagues in that group, just so you know, Joe Segali had reached out to Abby and I about interest in coordinating with the Rural Resilience group around some of the issues that I think are primarily falling under your task group. So, we can talk more about that offline, but I think there sounds like an opportunity to kind of engage with Joe. He's already put together a matrix of different strategies that would be good for you all to collaborate with them on. Good. All right, Ryan, how about your ag soils group?
Sure, absolutely. This is subtask group 5C. The task before the group is to identify and develop initiatives, programs, and strategies that reduce gross and net annual greenhouse gas emissions from Vermont's agricultural land and agricultural operations. We had our third meeting this morning at 8 a.m. So it's a climate-filled morning, which is good for a lot of the discussion we had this morning. That was very fruitful. There's been trying to start from a position of big picture, where do we want to go? If I was to make a word cloud of some of the terms that have come up, it's thinking in buckets, developing a menu of options for emission reduction, while thinking significantly about co-benefits, and then some high level thinking and being directionally. One thing that to me that comes to mind is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as a way to frame some of the details that may need to be worked out in the future, while trying to focus on some of the high level benefits that can come from looking at practices. And following the work plan, we've really dug into reviewing the existing ag emissions inventory prepared by DEC, which identifies sources of emissions for agriculture, and have begun to review the strategies and leverage points for each source of the emissions in the inventory, while also talking about the protocol itself. Discussion has ensued when reviewing the emissions inventory around gross versus net. There's a lot of opportunity to look at ag soils and the role they play. That is perhaps going to be addressed through task 5A, and so we've set that aside a bit for the moment now, and focusing on not focusing, but trying to look at a framework by which to begin to assemble these buckets, if you will, thinking about practices that affect enteric fermentation, feed diet of cows, manure management strategies, and then all about agricultural soils from fertilization and tillage. And we did a brief review and shared as homework to look at existing methods or inventories that have already been conducted at federal level and some state work to try to look at existing program frameworks for greenhouse gas emission reduction, while also making space to try to look at all of the co-benefit or issues that may arise from certain practices. So the homework that we're working on for our next meeting is working on thinking about building our own tracking matrix, if you will, or framework to begin quantifying the practices or inventorying the practices that affect each one of those big four buckets, while also trying to think more holistically about how those practices may more broadly impact a farm. And we haven't yet begun to tackle questions of cost of implementation, but the cost effectiveness versus more broad scale benefits is a conversation I imagine we'll be spending some time on in putting together that menu. So for next week, hopefully we'll have a developed matrix with which to begin inventorying different practices or practices that may affect some of those areas of emission from the inventory.
Excellent. Thank you. So the group that I'm helping coordinate around natural and working forest land storage and sequestration, we've discussed meeting every other week. This was an off week for us. I've just sent a doodle poll to the group to try to get something on the calendar for next week. My hope is that all of the subcommittee members can find a time to get together next week so we can talk about picking just a standing meeting time so that we don't have to deal with scheduling and we can get into more of a rhythm with our conversations, because we haven't done that yet. I think progress we've made so far, Alexandra has pulled together a shared doc for us to begin to capture some information and strategies. But I think really, and we had a good conversation the first time we did meet with the folks who were able to participate, but I'm looking forward to our next meeting to really kind of get things started in a more significant way. And, you know, Charlie, who was at the first meeting, or others, you know, feel free to weigh in, but I think we're getting off to a little bit of a slow start, but confident that we'll get rolling soon. Okay. And then the last task group is the carbon budget. And, you know, my understanding is that we're still somewhat waiting to see what consultant is selected and then kind of re-engage with them around the methodology. So I don't know, Jane, if there's any updates on, you know, where that process stands.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad that this came up. Thank you, Billy. So first, an update quickly is that we had a lot of interest in the RFP around the question timeline. So I should say that there was a timeline for consultants to ask questions, and 6 consultants asked a quite lengthy set of questions. So I expect we're going to have good interest in the RFP. It's open until Monday, and then we have some meetings scheduled with the review committee to digest those proposals and make a selection, hopefully quickly, so that we can begin the contract negotiation phase, which will take a bit of time. So again, we don't expect to have anybody on contract actually for another month, really, I think in practice. But I will say that the carbon budget was a focus of a lot of the questions from consultants, and sort of stirred up a dialogue with Allie and Ryan and Colin and a bunch of folks. So I think that the sooner we might want to start to think about how to engage with science and data, as well as this group, as well as I know we've talked about a smaller meeting, Ryan, with Ag Agency and DEC around ag components specifically. I think there's a lot of moving parts. And so we'll want to have our ducks in a row when the consultants come on board for the carbon budget, because that is outlined in the RFP as phase 1 of the work that they will do. So we don't want to wait till they get on board to be sort of still agreeing internally on what we want with that carbon budget. So I'll take on leadership with you, Billy, or help with you, Billy, to outline all the moving pieces so that we can get the right people around the table to start to have a conversation about that.
Okay, that sounds great. And I think the group that we have, you know, currently identified are myself, Alyssa, Lauren, and Ryan.
Awesome, thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, and then Iris, wondering as our liaison to Just Transitions, whether you have any updates you'd like to share with our group.
Yeah, so we had a really good long conversation about the guiding principles again, and we put together what we had taken from the Jamboard into some idea clusters, and we had some really good conversations about the specifics of each one. And so they're not quite guiding principles yet, and we're hoping to have those by the end of the month. But we really didn't make it through the rest of our agenda much. Not that there was a lot more besides a community share from Chris Campany. That said, there's going to be a community listen to Kaya Morris at our next meeting, and I think it's going to be really amazing. And I think that that would be a good thing if people wanted to join in on, just to hear her perspective and voice. I'm not sure if she's in this meeting right now. I saw her join, but if I don't know if she has any other updates or comments. Yeah, I think that's all.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Kai, feel free to add anything. And if not, do you have a date, Iris, of that meeting for folks who might want to join in?
It's next Thursday from 4 to 6. I don't remember what that date is, but it's on the website.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have a ton more to add. You did an amazing job. Thank you, Iris. Kind of consolidating everything that we did over 2 hours. But yeah, so we are hoping that this will give you all some stronger guidance on ways to look at this. So we're still, again, trying to set up what are the baseline principles. We need to define who impacted communities are. And we also want to be able to give some kind of guiding questions that you all may be able to use as you're thinking through the solutions that you'll have. So definitely looking forward to that and being able to share that more broadly. And if you need us here to have any more further conversations again around the letter that came from Renew Council, happy to be a part of those conversations as well. And if you haven't seen that, we can make sure that you get a copy of that as well.
Excellent, thank you. I do believe the letter went out to all of our subcommittee members, but if not, we can make sure that happens. And I think at some point in the not too distant future, we'll probably dedicate a large portion of this meeting to the principles, the issues that were raised in the letter, and just the broader conversation to make sure that we're all up to speed on the best way to proceed. So thank you both. Okay, anything else from task group report outs, things like that? Friendly reminder to my task group, please check your state email addresses and take that doodle poll as soon as you can. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna move on to, I think, our next item here. So we've got a little bit of time for a couple topics, and I don't have a big plan here other than just to keep some space on the agenda to check in on both the work that we did with Pat Field last week around kind of better fleshing out our tasks and subtasks. He developed a document based on our conversation, which I shared with you all earlier in the week. It's up on our website now as well. So wanted to just reserve a little bit of time to see if there's any questions or discussion of that. I think that's probably a tool the different task groups can return to as you get deeper into your work and use as, you know, at least the starting point for a further work plan. And then the other piece was just to get an update on the MCA tool from the folks that have been working on that in response to the good conversation we had a couple weeks ago. So I guess just anything on the piece that Pat shared, I can put it up on the screen if we need to discuss it. But I think, you know, my sense is that he did a nice job capturing our conversation. I'm sure there's things that need to be added, subtracted, revised, but you know, hopefully it gives the different task groups some progress in that further work planning. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Would it be helpful for anybody else if we screen shared that just so that we all have it to look at? Do you mind doing that, Billy?
I can try. Let's see. Screen share. Okay, let me know. Is it up? Okay. So yeah, I think, you know, as you can see here, Pat took each of the different task coordination foci and based on our conversation, plugged in additional tasks or steps to achieve the goals. And I don't know, Abby, if you want to go through each one of these, or if folks have thoughts on any particular ones, I can drive to them. So, you know, whatever you want.
I think I'm open to suggestions. I guess I'm looking at what's the working consensus at the moment from the group as to what would be best useful for our time at the moment. Do you feel like this has identified where we want to go? Are there glaring admissions? Is this where you want to be spending time right now, or are we, you know, where's everybody at?
I may suggest, since no one's really chiming in, that maybe this is something that we just let sit with the different task groups and, let them determine how to use this going forward. And, I think it was a helpful exercise for Pat to kind of talk us through the next steps. I think a lot of that is kind of implicit to us generally, but I thought it was a helpful way to start the conversation. So, my suggestion would be maybe we just let the different groups run with this and come back and report out at a future date, unless others have things we want to discuss today.
Well, one thing, Billy, I think, and it's probably all the task groups need to digest this to be able to respond. But maybe at the next meeting, this group could make sure that all the task groups are focused on a similar approach and kind of similar outcomes, so that we don't have one task group, going off on a total tangent from the other one, so that when we try to reconcile our work and compile it, that we have a new challenge. So it seems like at this level, there's some value of us making sure we're on in terms of instructions to the task groups.
I think that makes sense.
If there's sort of, maybe nobody's had enough coffee this morning. Is that the general consensus? Okay. Anyway, can we get general thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether we're like, good, putting this aside for the moment, utilizing it within the task groups as we see necessary, and moving on to talking about the MCA? I saw seeing thumbs. Great. Okay. So onward to MCA, or are we feeling like that's kind of in a similar place? Or is that the organizing mechanism with which we approach, to David's point, how the task groups are generally organizing and or filtering their information? And or, to the point of our full council meeting, how do we move forward but not get so far ahead of ourselves that we are putting forward or putting forth a ton of thinking and time into creating all these different buckets and structures and ideas that potentially, after engaging with stakeholders, we're going to hear that none of that is what anybody in the public is looking for, and we need to completely regroup. So thoughts welcome as to the challenges at hand. Alyssa?
Sure. I think that I heard David's comment a little bit different from the MCA tool being what binds our work together, but also thinking about all of us are in a couple of these like task groups where we're trying to get the homework done. And the way that we structure and organize our information and eventually present recommendations to the group, if that can be just the same kind of format, I think that's what I'm hearing as being helpful to figure out soon. And so maybe at the next meeting or subsequently, we can just try to make sure we can share some examples of structure or outline or skeleton of what things might be heading towards, so that we're making sure we'll have some cohesive document or shared framework. And that'll be just less work for us to like revise things later if we get on the same page. So if we, at some point, could each of the task groups kind of bring one piece forward, maybe that's 2 weeks from now or something, to say this is how we're going to present the research or the background work that we did. That could be helpful. What do you guys think? Or do we do that in our homework time, with the smaller meetings?
Thoughts? Feelings? I feel like I need a fire hose of coffee. Come on. No, I'm just... Watch.
I think for the purposes of being able to understand the format of how groups have approached their specific tasks, I think it would be great to be as consistent in language and perhaps physical framework of the materials to perhaps ease in a completely different approach, and then the synthesis at the end would be more easy to do, but also acknowledging perhaps some of the tasks and questions may be different between the groups. It may deviate slightly, but I would certainly support trying to get as close together as possible on how we're aggregating our information and reporting it out to the group would definitely support that. I'm happy to try to get there.
Well, as a possible, connection to the multi-criteria analysis too, after today's discussion with the Ag Task Group, we agreed we wanted to start with buckets rather than kind of dive straight into specific practices. And it occurs to me that, the multi-criteria analysis, we should think about whether it applies to buckets or really more at a more granular level. But that may be another, in some ways that multi-criteria analysis is another example of a format, that we could all agree that we're going to use as we get deeper into the specifics of each idea.
I'm wondering, and maybe Iris and Kaya, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but I'm concerned about the things that I've been hearing about stakeholder and public engagement, with the fact that we're trying to move along and coming up with building out solution, the skeleton of this work. And have there been any discussions in Just Transitions as to how that might look, or how we might be positively impactful in that versus negatively, or I don't know. I guess that's what I'm struggling with is how to keep some forward momentum, but not to get so ahead of ourselves that we're putting words in people's mouths or communities' mouths as to what they are, what the strategies are going to be. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about that.
I guess I'm certainly mindful of that as well, Abby. I think in some cases there are strategies that exist and that are being deployed currently here and in other places that at a minimum we should be aware of and capturing. And I think and discussing the relative merits of, and it seems like that's work that we can kind of begin. While still keeping an open mind from what we hear from, Vermonters. So it seems like those things can kind of proceed somewhat in parallel, as long as we don't get too far ahead of ourselves or too wed to any certain suite of practices or solutions before we get that input from the public.
Does that seem to be the broad consensus of the group? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs so-so?
Has this group gotten a chance to meet with the public engagement consultants yet? No. Is there an ability to do that? Because I think that would be really beneficial.
I would.
Yeah, thanks, Iris.
Entirely.
Yeah, and that's coming. It's just a matter of their contract's only just been signed, and I tried to speak to this earlier, but the idea is that we'll meet with them internally on Monday next week, and one of those goals, it will be to schedule them to meet with the 4 other subcommittees they haven't met with, as well as staff from the Public Service Department and the Community and Outreach Engagement Consultant that the Public Service Department has hired for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So yeah, if it's not next Friday, it'll be the Friday after.
Okay, then that seems okay to me.
Judy.
I would like us to sort of have consensus around direction and questions we're asking within each community, each committee, because I'm thinking of the Native community in Burlington and how marginalized they are, and the fact that people on these committees are discussing things like wastewater treatment facilities, which they have in their community, but yet they don't have city sewer. So the treatment's in their committee, but they live in Burlington and don't even have city sewer. And so at least if we have similar questions and directions, then we can come out with an equal path on everything we discuss.
I think that's a great idea. Oh, Charlie, I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Really, no, I think I agree with Judy in having kind of a uniform plan about how we approach that. I also think, and this might get back to the consultant thing, but having a more kind of refined understanding of how we're going to interact with the communities and how we're going to actually solicit that feedback. Until we know that, I don't know how to think about it, whether it's these meetings where we have public comment, or if we're actually going to communities that we've identified in a certain way, or if it's posting stuff online that they can read at their own time, until we have an idea of exactly what that looks like, it's hard to respond to this, I guess.
Okay, so try to collate what I'm hearing. Judy, to your point, it sounds like within how we engage with the with RISE about how we're structured, how we're going to go about public engagement, making sure that the assumptions and the approach in how we're even thinking about the questions is going to be necessary too, but that maybe that needs to be, it doesn't sound like maybe we're ready to go into that conversation yet, and maybe we should wait until we have the a meeting with, or our engagement with the with RISE Consulting. Does that?
Well, I think it's difficult for each of these task committees to understand where a marginalized group of people would be coming from if they don't have someone on the committee to at least address and direct you to where you might find these answers. But I do know that the Sea Grant at UVM has been working on all winter. I went to their meetings and they were working on a survey to be sent out to these communities as to their awareness around wastewater treatment facilities, compost facilities, and the impacts on the rivers and the lake where many of these people live. And so it might behoove us to figure out when that survey is completed, because that could help us to get some of those answers to the questions that Charlie was talking about. So again, just as the committees, the task force committees would have problems understanding, I can see how subcommittees in general, if they don't have BIPOC people on their subcommittees, they will also struggle with questions around equity and understanding different perspectives. And so it just seems to me that having a matrix or a list of questions or things that direct us in a common path will help to keep us on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be really helpful for all of us and have that value that you speak to. And I saw Jane Ray in the chat that hopefully that's something that we could get some support from the consultants on quickly and, have as a tool for all of us in the, within the next couple of weeks. It sounds like that might be possible.
If we feel, is everybody feeling comfortable with where we're at with that piece, that we're gonna, wait until we can build out a little bit more around that to move forward? And if so, are we feeling okay about moving to public comment, or do we want to have more discussion around this?
Could you ask that a question after we present what we're working on?
Yes.
Okay.
happily. Sure.
Thank you, because I think some of what our committee is going to talk about might answer a bit of that question.
Okay, awesome. Are we good to do a public comment and then we'll go into the discussion around that work?
Yep.
Cool.
Excellent. Great. So we're doing, we've added 2 opportunities for public comment this week. So thanks all members of the public who are taking your time to join us today. Those who are interested in speaking now, there will be another opportunity at the end of the meeting, so feel free to speak now, later, or both. We just ask that you keep your comments relatively concise. So anyone who's interested in speaking now, please use the raise hand function. And if you don't have access to that, just audibly indicate you want to speak. So I see Jennifer. Okay, so I think for this first public comment opportunity, Jennifer, floor is yours. If you could keep your comments relatively brief, that would be appreciated.
Thank you so much, everybody. I had a couple of comments I wanted to make. First, I really appreciate the conversation that was really started by Jane talking about public comment, and then lastly with Judy. And I realized how biased my thinking was. The first thing I was going to say was how great it is that there is such wonderful public access. As a member of the public, I feel like I've had incredible opportunity, first to go to these meetings, and second to look at the documents that are put up. And then I was realizing that I'm in a position where I can and do that. And that for many communities who are marginalized, many individuals, that's not the case. And so I appreciate the idea that the subcommittees and the Vermont Climate Council in general will reach out and figure out ways to engage communities, with the idea of not presenting them or the general public with a final product, but rather truly engaging them in what's going on. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I said this yesterday, I feel as if, as an ecologist, I might have some ideas and things to present. But at the same time, I realize that that is very biased. And so what I'm thinking in terms of forest ecology, for example, or forestry, I might have some ideas that I would say, well, let's create a tax incentive where people don't need to cut forest land, that maybe they get incentives for particular agricultural practices that sequester and store more carbon. But who are the landowners? And I brought this up at one point at a different meeting, and the idea of in forestry programs and forest ecology programs, who are the people who are students there, who get the positions? Again, it's not individuals within BIPOC communities who are well represented there. So there's this systemic piece of it that I think is going to be difficult to address. But I appreciate, this is the first time that I've really heard of these kinds of challenges being taken on. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think that it is, to be totally honest, really weighing heavily on a lot of us as to how to best navigate that reality, right? That's been an enormous part of I think a lot of our learning journeys, we say these things, you know, we have these programs, we have these great programs about incentives and all of these different things, but land ownership is not an equitable thing. The access points to land ownership are as much a part of the problem as the problems that are created after you own the land. And so, you know, how are we ensuring that as we're building out this body of work, we're addressing not just what's already happening on the land, but what hasn't been potentially able to happen on the land because of the lack of access to different communities, you know, what could have been in place potentially if land access was more feasible, and all of those different, the complex ways that those systems have been built historically, and how do we ensure that moving forward that those harms and the inaccessibility is not perpetuated. So appreciation for your comments today. Thank you. Was there anybody else from the public that wanted to bring anything forward?
Looks like Lauren's got her hand up.
I'll pause in case there's any more public comment though.
I think that looks like it for this round.
Okay, I just wanted to bring up something as we talk, especially about different communities across the state and how that type of work will land in each of our respective task conversations, subcommittee, council, all the different iterations of this big machine. It was raised during our MCA conversation a couple of weeks ago. It was brought up at the full council meeting by Sarika, who's our RISE consultant, and Kaya just brought it up at when she spoke earlier. How we define these different communities is really important, and I keep hearing from people not to use the term marginalized, that we should use the term impacted. So I want to make sure that we're sharing in that language, but also recognizing Kaya saying we have to define and identify who those communities are and what that actually means. So I would just flag that based on what I keep hearing, we should be using the term impacted, but also understand that there's a need to identify and define that as well.
Thanks, Lauren.
I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is learning for many of us, and my hope is to come at this from that space. You know, I would like for us to all move forward remaining as curious as we possibly can about all of this, right? About what the assumptions have been, about where the access has been, just to remain curious and open to learning, and to Lauren's point, you know, that this is iterative, right? And so as we're trying to learn, you know, as I think Kaya brought it up, the quote that I hear all the time at our climate council meeting, you know, as we know better to do better, and to sort of use that as as a guiding principle moving forward, and that, you know, this will be iterative. Sorry, I saw trying to read chat at the same time. If there is no other public comment, are we at a point where we're ready to dive back into the more open-ended discussion around, right? I think it's the discussion of the nature-based solutions and the foundational pieces that you guys had.
Yeah, I was going to kick that off for the group. So this is, you know, great segue into the discussions that we've been having in the nature-based solutions group. And we sort of realize, and this conversation is getting us there, that we, as a climate counselor, as a subcommittee, haven't really addressed in a concrete way, haven't talked about why we're here, why climate change exists. Not what is climate change, not the sources of greenhouse gases, but what systems and decision-making and way of thinking have got us in this position. And so talking about impacted communities is part of it, but really getting to not just the symptoms, which are, impacted communities, loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, but what is the cause of that? And so we've, it's exploitation of resources, extraction, exploitation of people, and recognizing that colonialism, imperialism has set us in a system that resource extraction is valued, profits are valued. And so we're just talking about this as thinking about it, because recognizing the cause helps us think about solutions, right? So, the trap is if we don't think about this, we could suggest solutions that just keep us perpetuating the same systems. And so, there's, it's heavy, it's big. A lot of us are working on this, on thinking about, decolonializing our way of thinking. And this is just something we've been talking about. How do we think about nature-based solutions in ways that address this causation, and help us think about, strategically thinking about solutions in a way that is not maladaptive, that's beneficial to all living beings in Vermont, and really sets us forward in thinking differently. So Judy has come up, has a great way of thinking about this and presented this to the group. And we've been talking about this in terms of specific ideas. How would this framework work? How does this work with our current systems that we have, right? We're in it. We're in this system that still has, is colonial and is imperialist. So how do we, bump against those? So Judy is going to present a different way of viewing things that might be a good framework for us to be thinking just differently. And I think we just all ask that everyone kind of has an open heart and open mind in thinking a little bit, differently about our way of life and about things here in Vermont.
Judy, I promised you I'd screen share for you. Are you ready for me?
I am, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
How's this for teamwork, right? So this is a map I use in my classes, and I want you to see where I'm coming from and why I'm coming from this. What do you all think this is? Tell me what you think this is.
Watersheds?
Watersheds, yep. What else? What does it look like to you? Okay, there's too many signs.
Veins and arteries.
Yes, that's right. My point is, I want you to see that this land we live on, this land called Turtle Island, is alive. The soil is alive. The place is alive. Everything we're talking about is alive. And all those veins are connected. They're connected through watersheds. And climate change, if we're not careful, is going to make that pink section one big section where all the veins are connected and there's no color to what's happening. So the next one, Lauren, thank you. The next one is this chart that Jane sent around to everyone. This is a way of thinking that I was raised with. So soil is the center. It's not people, it's not economy, it's soil. And everything the spine of the land does, from microorganisms to humans, everything they do has to be to protect the soil. And then the next concentric circle out is the band's land. And it was the responsibility of the bands who lived in specific watersheds to care for the water that cared for the spine of the land, that then cared for the soil. And it's all connected, we're all related. If that care doesn't happen, then, and that acknowledgement that what we do to the wetlands and the watersheds is going to impact the spine of the land and then impact the soil, we are going to be going down the same path of destruction that we're going down now. So then the nation's land is the land where all people speak the same language. And Gadakana is our world, our worldview. And it's out in that outer circle where you need to place economy. So if you have a healthy soil, a healthy spine on the land, and a healthy watershed, then you can think about economy. If you think about economy first, you may not end up with a healthy soil, a healthy spine of the land, and a healthy watershed. That's the path we've been taking for 400 years. It's not worked. We have to think outside of the box and put the soil and the water first. They are alive. They are animate words in our language. Animate because they're alive. And unless we start looking at it that way, we're going to go right down the same path. We were given prophecies many, many, many centuries ago in which we would come to a fork in the road, and that fork in the road, we would have to make a decision. One would be lush and green. If we followed that fork, we would have the opportunity to come together as one people and live in a good, healthy way. And that's one people, everything, not just humans, all microorganisms. The other path would lead us down to the path of destruction. And many people, many elders believe we're in that seventh fire right now, and that the misuse of technology and the misuse of chemicals and such is leading us down that path of destruction. And so in order to save us, I don't want to, well, I won't be here, but I don't want my grandchildren to be sitting here in 2050 saying, oh, they should have looked at this differently. They did all this work and they looked at it exactly the same way. And so then we have some questions. I think Lauren's gonna continue.
Yep, thanks, Judy. So as we were having those pretty foundational conversations in our nature-based group, we realized that it seemed like even though other groups are focused on slightly different things, that to Judy's point, we are all related, and the soil being at the center of all of our work, especially within the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, that there were just some general thoughts that we were jotting down during our conversations that weren't very agenda driven and therefore were really fruitful, actually. So just sharing some of those, and largely around, as we thought about our general approach to nature-based solutions, the word sustainable and sustainable relationships kept coming up, and the need to define what that looks like, and has clearly, as evidenced by our last 400 years, here on this land, not been sustainable. It's not a sustainable approach as we develop solutions and strategies as a group here, as a larger society, that we should be asking these 4.5 questions in the middle about sustainability that Judy said she's been asking for 40 plus years, and they seem incredibly relevant to each of our tasks, to our subcommittee, to the climate action plan in general, and thinking about potentially putting them in the MCA as well to make sure these conversations are happening at all the different levels of this work. So sustainability, generally speaking, the land's never going to be sustainable unless it's used for its intended purpose. And that was evident also in our MCA walkthrough of the net gains wetland policy, and where land wants to be wetland and where it does not is really important as an example. So questions that we should be asking in our respective task groups and as a larger subcommittee, and hopefully council, is does the practice reduce energy use? It's not just about how we're using energy, but how much we're using. Does the practice contribute to reducing waste? Does the practice support and or help the natural environment? And most importantly, does the practice promote fairness to all living things? And what fairness means and how we evaluate that's really important. And Judy hammering home the point that all living things does include the soil and does include the water as well. So really centering our work in that, wanting to share our thoughts, realizing that that shouldn't just be a discussion happening at the nature-based scale. I think I'm gonna stop sharing and ask Judy to take the mic back, I think. Judy, do we have more to add?
No, I thought John was gonna add a little antidote, but I
Okay.
don't see him. Is he
Oh,
here?
I'm here, Judy.
There you go. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I'm the comic relief. But enjoying our discussions, of course. Obvious to you all, I'm from England, and was brought up in a farming community where land had been farmed different ways, but for 2,000 years. And where I was brought up, there were even boundary markings for land that were erected or put up by Roman centurions. And the markings are still on the fence posts. Well, they're not posts, they're obviously stone pillars. But I told this little anecdote, which I believe is from Monty Python. And those of you who are familiar with Monty Python and their routines, anyway, they were interviewing a farmer about farming in general. And to every single question, he had only one answer, and it was, the answer lies in the soil. And that pretty much sums up our, sorry, Abby, that pretty much sums up our approach, that the answer lies in the soil. And I think it can be a guiding principle for a lot of us and a lot of the work we do. So I will now mute myself and
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge that Bob was a part of all of this too. Anyways, any questions to anything we're saying or about the questions we have that we're following in our committee? Charlie?
Yeah, I would just love to hear how your committee is. I love the framing of this, first of all, but I'd also love to hear just how your committee is thinking about defining nature-based solutions. Because my problem with all of this work is that I keep going like lumping, splitting. And I think, isn't all of this, or is this the, I mean, and I don't, so I'd love to hear your committee's thought around what makes something a nature-based solution versus not a nature-based solution, and how that's framing your task group and how you see it framing our task groups, I guess. Thanks.
Well, anybody on the committee can jump in here, but our committee meetings are more discussions. And somehow Lauren miraculously makes them into answers to the questions. But the discussion, in having time for the discussion, then all these solutions come out. And I'm trying to think of several of the discussions. One was about agriculture and using the land over and over and over again. And then the possibility of replenishing it with seaweed, as they've done on islands and coastal areas. And I was raised to do here in Lake Champlain because I was in South Euro, and replenishing it with seaweed that puts the carbon right back into the soil. And so all of these stories and all of these discussions are coming out. Our meetings are lengthy because it's more of a discussion format. And they bring us down the path of answering all the criteria that is being asked of us. And Lauren's really good about putting that all into the appropriate slots. Does anybody else have, Lauren, you have, Alexandra, do you have comments about that?
I'll just add, I'm not sure how good I am at capturing everything, but thanks, Judy, for that vote of confidence. That we did spend a great deal of our first conversation, long form, talking about how we define nature-based solutions. And there are a lot of different definitions out there, and we kind of honed in on 3. But I think generally speaking, if I'm looking at our notes ish correctly, it's largely talking about working within and enhancing nature and natural systems to help address societal challenges. So that's where like the sustainable management and use of nature for those societal challenges comes up. And that of course would devolve or evolve into conversations about what sustainability looks like or means. So like Charlie, we've talked about in our like 5E conversations, so much of this work is interrelated across our different tasks that's why we kind of thought elevating this conversation and recognizing that nature-based solutions aren't going to be completely housed within ours. I hope that we're all figuring out how to elevate natural systems roles in tackling the climate crisis, but also just other issues of our time.
Is what you shared just now something you've already sent around, or is it something that you would be willing to send around? I would love to like read that more in depth and use the 4 questions. I think those are great foundational questions to really get at the heart of what we're trying to solve for and how we're trying to move forward. So I'd love to be able to incorporate that in across the board as we move forward.
Which is exactly why I asked you to wait with your question, because I too believe those questions can be helpful to all the committees as they go through and answer the buckets. Discuss the buckets they have listed. They're questions I've used in my classes forever. And normally in environmental studies, you can find the first 3 in one place or another. But the 4th one changes the whole scenario when you request, is there fairness to all living things? Then you become, you enter into that equity area. And I think, I think maybe Lauren can copy them and put them in the chat for people. Maybe, Lauren? Yeah.
She did.
And hit send right as you said it, Judy.
Okay.
I can send them around in email form too.
Okay. But yeah, I find them very helpful in discussing simple things like when I'm working with students, let's take a look at this path we're walking on. Is this sustainable? And then they start answering the questions and they're like, no, we're going to have to move it in a few years because all this erosion is happening. And so for them, they become clear questions to help them solve environmental issues. And I thought, well, if they can work for children, they can work for us.
That seems reasonable. No promises, but I think sometimes kids are a little more on point than adults in these regards. How's general consensus around this? What thoughts, feelings, feedback, concerns? David?
You'll have to forgive me. I'm going to wind up. This is going to be a kind of a big swing. So it'll take me a couple minutes to get through. But if you bear with me, I think I'll connect all the dots. I love this line of thinking, and I love the way Judy presented it and the circles, and that Lauren distilled it into such questions. I've been having the same conversation with a different language, and I want to try to connect it because I think there may be other people like me that are trying to connect dots to the work that we're going to produce that will ultimately be a set of recommendations that need to be adopted by policymakers and legislators. And ultimately, frankly, by business owners, by landowners, by the public and consumers and the like. Like we're talking about transformational change, and we can't necessarily own the entire system change, but we can think about how to frame our work and nest it within that. I want to start with a brief disclaimer that I bring this strong sense of urgency to this that is personal to me. That's just personal to my life, my career, my profession. And I recognize it comes out, there's a certain degree of white supremacy thinking that goes in with urgency. There's a degree to which I know I should be stepping back and slowing down and kind of letting the process take me and go with the flow. I'm personally struggling with that. So with that as an aside, I'll say that the thing, as having spent a career in law, environmental law, I've lived in this tension between what I would consider three different groups of people: the kind of ecological thinkers that think about systems and complexity and community, the people who are engineer, business people, the doers that are about like, tell me what to do and what the goals are and I get it done. And then the people that, I put myself in this category of thinking about legal, economic systems to figure out how do we work within those systems to drive change. And all of those groups of people I'm talking about, I'm assuming that they all have a shared commitment to driving environmental change. So there's a broader group of folks that as you grow out the circle, it's really big. There may be people that just don't care. And I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about, people with a shared ultimate goal and value. But why do we keep bumping into each other and not solving these problems? How is it that in my lifetime, we haven't made more progress? And I go back to this idea of ecological thinking, that the beauty of ecology as a science, as it emerged in the early part of the 20th century, was that it shifted from the incredible leaps forward of physics and chemistry and biology. And instead of thinking in a reductionist way about getting smaller and smaller and understanding every little particle of the universe as separate from everything else, ecological thinking asks a different question. How does everything relate to everything else? How does biology relate to physics, to chemistry? And within biological systems, how do the soil microbes relate to the trees that relate to the birds, relate to the what have you? And if there's any shortcoming of ecology, it was that it remained in that kind of the idea that science was separate from humans. And if you take ecological thinking to its full logical extent, humans are part of these systems, and we need to think about human systems and embrace complexity of human systems, which is almost beyond the ability to kind of sort out. But if we go there, when we think about human systems and we take all those values that Lauren captured in her questions and Judy captured in her diagrams and her explanation, and bring it back to Vermont. We have a state system of laws, a constitution. We have an economic system. We have in some ways our state slogan, unity and freedom and unity, capture some of the tensions and trade-offs. Is we want to encourage people to make a set of decisions that capitalism encourage, that our legal system protect, that are independent, based on property rights, based on kind of each person for him or herself. And at the same time, it encourages unity, the idea that we're all in this together. And there's kind of this tension embedded in our state slogan. That's also a tension embedded in our ability to solve these problems. So bringing this all down to like a more concrete level, I've thought about that as we think about our work, one interesting challenge for us is that we keep having these arguments about what kind of forest is the best forest. And it skips over a question of, well, whether it's a managed forest or a wild forest misses the point of, if it's not forest, if it's subdivisions or it's an industrial parking lot, it's not providing any service. It's cutting exactly the direction that we want to go. Same for farming. Arguing about which kind of farming loses the argument or the point that if we need to farm and we need to raise our own food, and if we don't have farming, we can't do that. And if it's subdivisions and industrial parking lots, if we turn Vermont into suburban Connecticut, we're not making the kind of change that we need to change. So thinking about our baseline, and that brings to economics and legal system. How do we protect the ability of humans that live on this landscape to make a living on the land? So economics may not be the center, but it has to be something in the mix of complexity that we think about. individual property rights. Unless and until we change our fundamental system of government and conversation, the modern American and Vermont governments were founded on a deeply racist idea that it was our land and we could just divide up and use it. With that said, it is the system that we have. And unless we want to, as a climate council, recommend, the abolition of private property rights, which I don't think would fly politically, then we need to think about the complexity of how do we factor in this human system that we live within. We don't have to make it the center, but we have to think about how that factors into the recommendations that we make. And then the very last point that I'll make is about, and this is where we're in some ways wearing my Audubon hat, which is about the idea that we can look to indicators to understand the health of the forest, the health of the soil, the health of our systems. That is, when we have farms or forests that are devoid of wildlife, then it's almost by definition being managed poorly and not fully recognizing all the value. Our wildlife, our birds, our amphibians, our insects are indicators of the deeper ecological health. And if we are managing our working lands and our wild lands and the way we live on the land generally effectively, we should see strong responses from all of those wildlife systems. So I'm hopeful that as we think about our ideas and evaluate them, that we build those kind of factors into our evaluation. And I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We discussed that at great lengths, and that's why those outer rings, when you start talking about the nation and the worldview and how each one looks at each other's perspective, that's where we included economy and the laws and all the things you're talking about. And the reason we put them out there, or the reason I put them out there, is because think of it this way. I don't know if you have children, but you wouldn't send your children to school if they were sick. You would work on getting them to feel better first and then send them to school. That's what we're trying to say. Work on getting the soil and the water better before you start thinking of making money off the soil and water, because they're going to just get sicker if you don't. And so if you notice throughout these meetings, I've made comments about, don't you want to change the order of that? And don't you want to put taking care of the soils in Vermont first, and then encouraging agriculture to make money off it? And sometimes it's a matter of simply changing the order of words. I read that letter that Jane sent us from Governor Scott, and he, in every page that he recommends how the money is spent, money is first, not the health and care of every component he's talking about, but let's make money. And that's important. I'm not saying it's not. I want to be able to sustain myself as well. But what I'm saying is it can't come first. What has to come first is healthy soil and healthy water and the healthy spine of the land, because it's all related, it's all interconnected. And the phenology of this state is all messed up because of climate change. When the shadbush are in bloom right now in the highlands, the shadfish are flowing in the lowlands, and the shadflies are supposed to be out for the shadfish to eat, but they're not here. It's all mixed up, and we've got to get that all back together again. We've got to produce healthy soil and healthy waters and a healthy spine for the land before we can even think of money. And like I said, it's just a matter of changing the order of thinking. Any other comments?
I was just going to share my reflections on both your thoughts. And I think, you know, I'm struck that it seems like we kind of need to do both simultaneously, right? We have to appreciate that there is a framework, I think, as David articulated, that is kind of constraining the way that we operate to some extent through the laws and delivery systems that we have in the state. And then there's these real problems with that system that I think we appreciate. And I think you've really been able to articulate, Judy, that I think many of us are committed to trying to change. And I don't know that we'll be able to fully change that framework in time to ignore it. So I think being mindful of both those things and trying to do the best that we can given those constraints to realize your goals, Judy, with the kind of realities that David shared, seems like a place that we're going to need to spend some time navigating a course through. That's just my own personal sense of where the conversation's going.
Traditional ecological knowledge needs to be included in everything discussed.
Yep.
Alyssa?
Yeah. A hawk just landed outside my window while you were talking, and it's like really incredible to see that creature during this conversation. So if I keep looking that way, that's why. But it just like heightens the the beauty of where we're focusing on such important things right now. And I don't have like something beautiful and amazing to add. So, but I was reminded of, you know, in my research at UVM, I've interviewed farmers and hosted focus groups and asked them about what enables them to invest in soil health, to invest in the natural landscape and the ecological health of their farms. And everyone I talk to like wants to be a good steward. And I think I would be really curious if we could add to our community engagement process some questions to people about what limits and enables their capacity to enhance ecological health and soil health and these outcomes that we value, not just carbon sequestration, that too, but all the other pieces that we're talking about. And I think the answers to those questions may get us to the types of strategies and tools and like programs that we're supposed to recommend. And it's funny for the conversation to go like, let's get away from economics, but that is the main limiting factor for farmers that want to invest in biodiversity and soil health and water quality outcomes, is they're in this system where they're only compensated for producing more food. And so if there's a way that we can offer financial incentives or cost shares to help them make the changes that enhance ecological performance, most of them are ready to do that. They're just limited by kind of being stuck in this grind. I'll stop now.
Alyssa, I so appreciate you bringing that up. Judy and I have actually had some of those conversations too offline as to the limiting factors, the very real limiting factors that are on people right now as to why some of those things aren't happening. And the fact that unfortunately, you know, the incentive structures aren't there. The compensatory, the flexibility and the capacity for innovation for people is not something that we have, that our current models of production have made possible for the broad majority of people in the context of land stewardship. So let's see, I'm not sure whose hand went up first, Ryan's, John's, or Lauren's. I think Ryan's. Nope. Ryan's pointing this way, which is this way on my screen. So I'm going to say John.
I think it's actually Lauren, but anyway.
Come on, guys. Somebody talk.
I will jump in. What was I going to say? To Alyssa's point, I mean, one thing more practical is that, you know, in my work over the years, both as a farmer with the agency and what I do now, farmers respond to incentives to do better things. I mean, this is how we've achieved progress on water quality, and much of what we've achieved on water quality also has climate benefits. And, you know, I think farmers are education, they are very good at responding to there is a better way to do this. And I think what excites me about improving soil health is I cannot really see a downside to improving soil health. It's all upside. It will improve, oh, excuse me. Can't stop it. It will improve water retention. It'll improve, I mean, I don't have to go through with that. You all know that. So I think there is a lot of things that we can do down the road. And yes, it's a great pity that farmers are in this economic backwater where, you know, a cheap food policy is far more important than a proper way to reward the growing of food in this country and around the world.
Lauren, Ryan, whichever.
I'll go, and then Ryan can go after me, although Ryan's pointing both ways. So this might actually just be bleeding into the conversation about their big brainstorms, which is kind of cool anyway. I'll just say that I don't have kids, but I was a kid once. And one of my least favorite things I was ever told as a kid when I asked why was because that's the way it's always been done. And if you are a parent and you say that to your kids, shame on you. But also just a recognition that, yes, there are constructs of society, certainly of capitalism, certainly of, you know, Vermont state statutes and regulations. And yet I feel very strongly that as we have conversations about solutions, we should be pragmatic and understanding what those limitations are, but we should also be starting at a point from here is the best thing we can do to achieve what we need to achieve. And then use those limiting factors to say, and here's why we can't. We shouldn't just say, well, we can't do that. We need to say, like, this is the best thing we can do. And here is what's stopping us from doing that. And capturing that, I think, is one of like the most powerful tools to identifying and elevating why we are limited and doing this work, why we haven't been able to actually elevate natural systems and tackle climate change. And in the absence of doing that, we're just cutting ourselves off at our knees before we can even get started. And I say that not as like an optimist, because I'm not, unfortunately, but that there are moments where we're going to be discussing those parameters and those limiting factors and feasibility. And I dropped in the chat what Ryan recommended we potentially consider as like economic feasibility and institutional feasibility are on there, and those are huge limiting factors, but we should still do our best to recommend our best and say why they won't work in the hopes that those things can eventually change. And I'm stepping off my soapbox for Ryan to jump in.
Great, thanks. Lauren, yes, those 6 feasibility dimensions are an opportunity to look at ways to evaluate one of the requirements that's put to the Climate Council from the charge of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think my comments, I want to be brief, but just to speak, fully in support of this approach and trying to understand and wrestle with as holistic a process as possible to understand how farmers and agriculture intersects with natural systems. And I think that there is a real, as John shared, a real upside to focusing on soil and the potential for improving, providing food security, water quality improvements, and of course this climate resilience mitigation adaptation strategy. And I, from the work of the Payment Ecosystem Services Working Group, farmer-led, there's a whole drive with a whole lot of people trying to look at building new system, right? That's what the vision is, a new system in which farmers are, recognized for their ability to contribute. While also, I think what's also important in this conversation is not only farmers, right? There's a whole intersection with the rest of the landscape, and acknowledging that a farm is more than the crop fields, right? It's the barns as well, it's the people, but it's also the forest and water that runs through that land as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to approach this from the ag side. I'm very optimistic of engaging in this approach and consideration in developing the ultimate recommendations from this working group. So thanks.
Allie?
So many buttons. Yeah, just briefly, just to kind of second what a couple of people have said and Alyssa's comments about the economic burdens that landowners and folks working on the land face, and that's the same with forestry. I think there's a lot of folks that would like to do different forestry practices, but the economics really aren't there because of our wood markets, really. And we have global wood markets, and other systems have undercut prices, and so it's really challenging. And I think this is actually a good example how we kind of merge these different ways of thinking, right? It's not saying, oh, we're gonna not recognize that economics are important right now in our current system, and maybe payment for practices is a good way, but is that a good long-term solution? We're kind of putting a band-aid on the issue. Why do we not value farm products that come from sustainable agriculture, or wood products that come from sustainable forestry, right? So it's like we might have to do immediate solutions, but we should also frame that in, is this, what are the systems that are creating this? And are there ways that we could, as Vermonters, influence some of those, issues that we have? Because it's really embedded into these, issues that we're facing. And so I think that's, great way to frame it, to look at, get some input from folks from outside. What are their main barriers to addressing some of these issues? And that would really help us understand what are some concrete solutions that we can come up with.
Thank you, everybody. Is there any other follow-up questions or comments around any of that? And I'm noting the time and just wondering if I should call forward the question from earlier, which now, of course, I can't remember what exactly it was, but I think it was something along the lines of, is there consensus around moving forward now that we've heard this approach and heard the build out of the why and the how? For the record, I was the kid that asked how, and it drove my parents insane. I hope for all of your sakes you don't get that kid. But does this fit? Is this a way that we want to build moving forward from this discussion, and to integrate those questions into how we're building out our thinking and our work? Really? Not a thing?
I mean, I think I heard, I won't speak for myself, but what I perceived was there was a lot of support for embedding, at the very least, these 4 questions in our process within the subtask groups to inform the whole process. So I definitely I heard support for that.
I think so too. I want to make sure we've reached consensus on that. Great. That was like pulling teeth from you people. Okay, looks like we are setting assignments and agenda for our next meeting. How did people feel about today? Did this feel like a good use of our time? Do we want, I forget if we already have something sort of in the pipeline. Billy, maybe you can help prod my memory as to what next week is supposed to be, or whether
Yeah, so there's a few kind of outstanding topics that folks have mentioned wanting to discuss. You know, it sounds like at some point we may want to come back to the MCA tool to kind of dive deeper into that. And I defer to the rest of the group on the timing around that. I know Ryan has long been interested in talking around some of the kind of technical soils pieces that he thinks will be helpful for this group. Some good information there. We were wanting to hear from the public outreach consultant, and you know we'll need to hear from Jane whether that's something that can happen next week or the following week. And then there was some discussion about whether we wanted to, after folks have had a chance to digest it, look at that subtask document that Pat shared to make sure that we're all kind of generally working at the same level of granularity and focus in their different task groups. So that's the kind of running list that I'm keeping.
One additional thing, Billy, maybe you said it and I just missed it, but I think as we think about guidance to the task groups about formats for things, I'd like to suggest that we wrap the multi-criteria analysis into that discussion so that we don't lose that work. Because Lauren did a really nice job of updating that and subjected herself to listening to the recording of all of us. So I think we should reward that that effort by making sure we wrap that into the discussion about task group work.
Yeah, thank you. And I do think that, you know, while we kind of bled into it today, I think it's Abby and I's intent to keep kind of a space for open conversation on the agenda so that we're not just bound by what's on the list. So I think that's one big discussion group is kind of guidance around or discussion of kind of the subtask task group structure or guidance, and then the MCA. Then there's the public outreach bit, and then you know the information Ryan wants to share with us. So I don't know, Jane, if you have any thoughts on kind of when we might be able to hear from the public outreach consultant.
We're meeting with them next week, and I haven't tried to schedule them into subcommittees yet. And they're not the easiest folks to schedule.
Okay, so let's not plan on that.
I'll hope that it's,
yeah, let's not plan on that for next week. Maybe we block some time next week to look at the MCA and the subtask document and just have that conversation as David and others suggest, and get folks all aligned so that the task groups can kind of proceed with shared expectations.
I will say that I hope to have better idea on timelines and milestones for those components at least, which hopefully can inform that conversation.
Okay, great. So I don't know that there's any assignments for next time other than to review the subtask document that Pat developed, any information that Lauren had sent out on the MCA, and then just to engage with your task groups around whatever kind of substantive work is happening there. Any other thoughts or comments on this piece? Okay, we'll try to get a more formal agenda out earlier in the week than we did this time. Apologies for that. Okay, so we're just about on schedule for our second round of public comment. Again, any folks who are interested, please raise your hand if you can with the hand function, or just speak up.
Okay, this is Paul Bruja from Sutton. Can you hear me?
I can, Paul, thanks. So we've got you and Carl Baer. Anyone else interested at this point in time? Okay, well, why don't each of you take a few minutes to share your thoughts and Paul, why don't we start with you if that's okay?
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. I'm referring back to the committee's charge in the document that was produced February 18th, where you had a 4-part charge. And I've been listening to your discussions over the last several meetings, and I'm increasingly, well, a little bit frustrated, I guess, but I'm increasingly looking at the so what question, and as in, like, so what can Vermonters do about it? I have a big property here in Sutton, 500 plus acres, and it's in a whole lot better shape than when I was a kid 75 years ago, when it was all sort of abandoned pasture. And I think rationally, when you look at what the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee should be focused on, it would be on improving the existing programs, the best management practices. And I'm not talking about just the lowest common denominator here. I'm talking about real best management practices with a focus on increasing resilience and productivity of the lands in Vermont. And I think you've got a whole bunch of programs that we're, you know, like action plans for watersheds. You've got all kinds of agricultural practices. And the reality is that we landowners need to enlist in those beneficial programs in order to achieve what you're talking about as far as sustainability and increasing the resilience of our natural ecosystems. And those are the primary tools that we have available to us. And one other point, maybe it's a corollary to it a little bit, is you were talking about what out of bounds products, in other words, things produced beyond the boundaries of Vermont, we're doing in terms of our carbon budget and how we should or should not consider those. And it seems to me right now that the only impact Vermonters can have on those out of bound products and services is either by not using them, just don't drive your car and use gasoline, for example. And essentially that by not doing that, your impact would be kind of minimal. So that's kind of two thoughts I'd have for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And I just a quick response. Certainly, a big focus of this group is to inventory and become aware of all those existing programs that landowners are working with now, and just keeping those front of mind as we look at strategies going forward. So thanks for that.
May I just?
Well, I thank you. Go ahead.
May I just ask quickly, do you feel like I assume you're a private landowner and not a farmer, is that, or not a forester?
Well, I had a career in the U.S. Forest Service, so I consider myself a forester. I also ran the American Fisheries Society for a dozen years, so I consider myself a fisheries biologist, and I have a master's in wildlife, so I'm kind of a wildlife person too. So all that being said is over the course of my lifetime, all these things have sort of gotten integrated, and my land is an old hill farm up here, right adjacent to the Sheffield Wind Project. And, when you talk about doing things for sustainability, the Sheffield Wind Project doesn't answer my need, I'll tell you that.
Well, and I think that that's something we want to keep it, as landowners, and maybe this is something that you could spend some time, I don't know whether you have access to the public portal or not, but certainly I think it's going to be really interesting for us to be able to engage with private landowners to understand what programs they know about and what they don't. And, that's something that I certainly don't feel like I completely understand. And, so that we have a fuller understanding of what you see on the ground as a landowner in terms of what you might need or not need. Right.
Well, I'd be happy to help any way I can, because I feel like the work that you're doing is tremendously important, and it's got to be reality based. And that's why I get a little frustrated with your discussion a little bit. I understand where you're going, and I think it's in a good direction.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your comments today, and we'll try to work them into our thinking moving forward.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Carl, please share your thoughts. I think you're muted, Carl. Sorry about that.
No, it's
There
my
you
job.
go.
It's
There
my
you
job
go.
to unmute myself. No, I just want to thank you for concentrating on our soils and our forests as the source of the sponge we need, and the carbon sinks that we need. So I appreciate that. And I think also want to say how lucky we are to be in Vermont, even to have it articulate these kinds of thoughts, these ecologically based thoughts, because I spent twice I've been in Virginia, and I've seen what's going on in the Southeast, which is the mining of the forests. We're far from that, and I didn't see any solar in Virginia, and I spent a lot of time in Virginia taking care of my grandchildren. So I really appreciate where you're going. I think keeping your eyes on the prize, which is managing our forests as a carbon sink. I'd like to see some old growth built into the system, and I'd like to see the continued management of our soil. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other members of the public interested in sharing your thoughts at this time? Just a reminder, as Abby mentioned, there is a public portal up off of the Climate Council website that is always available to take written comments, documents, things of that nature. Okay, that does it for our agenda today. Anything else folks want to speak to before we break? All right, well, thank you all for your participation and great thoughts, and we'll get an agenda out ASAP and see you all again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.